In this episode, we're going to explore a question that's been asked for centuries. Is this poem beautiful or just plain insulting? Stick around for a reading, summary, and analysis of My Mistress's Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hair be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked, red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks, and in some perfumes there is more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go, my mistress when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love is rare as any she belied with false compare. It's quite a poem, isn't it? This is actually my wife's favorite love poem of all time. But like we said in the introduction, a lot of people find this poem just straight up insulting. So what's going on here? The first thing we should talk about, though, is part of the title, mistress. Mistress back then did not necessarily mean someone you were having an extramarital affair with. It was just the female equivalent of mister, so it could be the head of a household. Although some people think Shakespeare wrote this poem about someone he was having an extramarital affair with. So go figure, who knows? Either way, you've probably heard in class or looking it up another title for this poem, which is Sonnet 130. And this is indeed a sonnet. It's part of Shakespeare's large collection of sonnets, and it's the 130th one in that collection, which is why it has that number. So let's talk about that form first, because the sonnet was the very first type of poem to be read silently. They're very personal, but they're also very restricting. So what makes this poem a sonnet? First off, it has 14 lines. Secondly, it has a specific rhyme scheme. And you might notice something about this rhyme scheme. At the very end, those last two lines, they rhyme. They are a couplet, and because they are a couplet, it makes this a Shakespearean or Elizabethan sonnet, as opposed to a Petrarchian or Italian sonnet, which has a different rhyme scheme and doesn't rhyme with a couplet at the end. So if you need to know what type of sonnet you're looking for, you could look at who wrote it. Sometimes that lets you know, but if it doesn't, you can just look at the very end and see, do the last two lines rhyme or not? Another major factor in a sonnet is that it's in iambic pentameter, which is 5 pairs of unstressed followed by stressed syllables. So you can hear those if you read the words with some extra emphasis. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. So you can hear that sort of heartbeat-like pattern to it. And there's a couple lines that don't follow a strict iambic pentameter, lines 2 and 5 in particular, but for the most part, this poem is very uniform. So you might be asking yourself, why write this way? Well, it can be helpful to answer this question by thinking of some other artists. Think of songwriters, for instance. Almost all songwriters follow a verse, chorus, verse pattern. Not all, but many do, right? Or what about painters? If you've ever been to an art gallery, you probably noticed that many paintings are in rectangular or square frames. Now, you don't have to do it this way, and there's a lot of people who don't. But it's part of a pattern, it's part of a form. And what a lot of artists discover is that following patterns usually fosters creativity rather than hindering it. Because there's so many restrictions, you have to think outside of the box and you have to come up with solutions that you wouldn't have otherwise thought of. And Shakespeare, of course, wrote poems that weren't sonnets, but the sonnet was one of his favorite forms, and he uses it quite a lot in his poetry and even in his plays. So let's get back to the poem. I always tell my students the key to understanding this poem is identifying what we call the volta, or a shift in tone, a shift in stance from the speaker of the poem. And what I want you to do is take a look at the poem again, maybe pause the video and read it out loud once or twice, and see if you can identify the shift in tone. Your voice might just naturally do it. Where does the poem sort of go in a different direction? I'll give you a few seconds to do that. Okay, either you paused or you were just listening to silence. So let's get back to it. Did you say that the volta was "and yet" right at the couplet? Because if you did, you are correct. Congratulations. You can hear it, right, in your voice. And yet, by heaven, right, you shift your voice a little bit. So that's the key to understanding this poem. Everything before the volta is an insulting metaphor or simile. Her eyes are not like the sun. Her lips are not like coral. Her breasts are mouse colored. Her hair is black wires, right? It seems super, super insulting. She's got stinky breath, right? Very insulting. But everything after the couplet is kind of beautiful, and it makes the beginning, or everything in the couplet is beautiful, and it makes the beginning of the poem make sense. So in order to understand the couplet, you have to know what every word in the poem means, which you should know any time you read a poem. Look up what all the words mean. But in the couplet in particular, the word belied is kind of an old 400-year-old word that we don't use too often, but it means to disguise or deceive, trick. You can hear the word lie in it, belied, right? So let's read that couplet again with that in mind. So my mistress, she doesn't have eyes like the sun. She's got stinky breath, blah, 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 all that. And yet, by heaven, by God, right? I think my love for her is as rare as any she has heard false with comparison, as any fake love that she's heard with false compare, right? Because the key to this poem is that the message is arguing for something that most poems don't. A lot of poems at this time, and still today in songs to this day, make comparisons like saying your eyes are as beautiful as the sun, but no one's eyes are like the sun. So you see, Shakespeare argues that this love is not true because it is the most beautiful, but because it is the most real. Even though she doesn't have eyes like the sun, even though sometimes she has stinky breath, even though she treads on the ground when she walks, she's real. And because of that, the speaker is in love with her. It's a beautiful message. So let's talk about lasting influence. I couldn't find a lot of examples of this poem in pop culture, probably because it's a little weird to throw a 400-year-old sonnet into your movie randomly. But I did find one, and that's from an episode of My So-Called Life. So hey, if the poem's good enough for Jared Leto, it's good enough for us, right? Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe if you want to see more videos about poems and theater and literature related analysis. And if you have any questions about this poem or suggestions for future videos, make sure to drop them in the comments. Thanks again for watching this far. You guys are awesome. Have a great day, and maybe I'll see you next time.